Hello, I'm Mischievous Marchinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy number 15, all of the Amazing Spider-Man annuals, and all of the big major crossover events from the 1980s. But those don't count. Neither do the annuals. That's where I stand. I think I lost the thread here, but I'm going to keep going.
And I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I too own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, the ones that are in the crossovers or not, which I say definitely account. But for me, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy. Wait, Mark, I gotta cycle back on this. Do you actually own like Inferno proper? Like there's no real Inferno book. I guess it's like a major crossover. Are you saying that you collected those events
No,
just
no, no,
for
no.
the tie-ins?
I'm just alluding to like all of the ancillary Spider-Man title tie-ins to Inferno and to Acts of Vengeance. And I guess when it comes to annuals like Atlantis Attacks, although we're not talking about that today.
You will find any instance to reference Atlantis Attacks. It's like get out your Amazing Spider Talk bingo cards.
There you go.
Mark references Atlantis Attacks in an episode. That gets you at least one or two blocks.
I work it in like it's attached with a rivet gun.
Oh boy, here we go.
Welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us for more Marvel Madness, the 9th episode of Season 7 of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, if you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, be sure to subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review.
This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early reviews and seasonal episodes, exclusive podcasts, and artwork, and help to keep this podcast going ad-free, please go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and click on the big Patreon button to sign up.
Yeah, on this season of The Amazing Spider Talk, we've been traveling back to the late 80s and early 90s to an era of Spider-Man's history that saw his comic completely visually reinvented, with sales reaching a peak that will likely never be replicated and a whole host of creative voices that would go to change the comic industry forever. Yes, we're talking about the early half of writer David Michelinie's run on Amazing Spider-Man, where he worked alongside the founders of Image Comics, Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, married off Peter Parker, and introduced the world to the hottest Spidey villain since the Ditko days, none other than Venom.
In this episode, we will be discussing the first line-wide events that crossed over into Spider-Man comics as Marvel began to realize in the wake of Secret Wars just how much attention they could bring to their entire line of characters and titles if they could find big stories to anchor them around, if only for a moment in time. In the late 80s and early 90s, the shockwaves of the X-Men event entitled Inferno and the Avengers and Fantastic Four event entitled Acts of Vengeance hit the entire line of Spider-Man comics. It set a precedent for his inclusion in a grander Marvel story, even at the cost of reshaping the stories occurring in his book. Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, if you want to follow along with our conversation, we're going to be talking about the following issues: Amazing Spider-Man 311 through 313 and 326 to 329, Spectacular Spider-Man numbers 146 to 148 and 158 to 160, and Web of Spider-Man 47, 48, 59 to 61, and 64 and 65, as well as What If number 31, which is kind of loosely associated with all of these things. I will say most of these are available on Marvel Unlimited, mostly because they're tying into big events, and for whatever reason, Marvel Unlimited has prioritized the inclusion to have those complete events up there. There are a few collections in paperback or hardbound that cover these periods, like Spider-Man Legends Volume 2, Todd McFarlane, which covers all of his stuff. Amazing Spider-Man by David Michelinie and Todd McFarlane, and as an omnibus, as well as the David Michelinie and Eric Larson omnibus. Is it omnibuy? Omnibuses? I'm not really sure. There is an Acts of Vengeance omnibus, as well as a Spider-Man The Cosmic Adventures storyline that covers that as well. And there's also the Assassination and Cosmic Adventures Epic collections. So there's a lot of different stuff that kind of piecemeal collects these things that are scattered across all of those books. So if you have some of those, you might be able to get a few issues here and there to read it. But because it's so scattered, it's probably best to just read them digitally or seek out the single issues themselves. Some of these are not very hard to come by, although anything with a Todd McFarlane cover on it tends to fetch a higher price. Especially like the Lizard issue in this is a pretty classic cover. And, you've got the first appearance of Cosmic Spider-Man, which I have to imagine goes for a pretty penny these days, now that it's been a kind of frequent inclusion in a lot of video games and things like that. And Lord knows, maybe we'll get a movie with it. I don't know. But yeah, you can find these most anywhere in digital, or, the original issues, probably the smartest way to keep up with this.
All right, Dan. Well, why don't we get into the thick of things here? Let's talk about the events themselves first, I think, just to kind of set the table. I'm going to talk a little bit about Inferno here. It's the first ever X-Men book crossover. And, we all know how Mark loves his X-Men mythology. So, I'm gonna do my best here to describe this. Take a drink for every mispronunciation here. There's going to be a lot. But basically, Inferno, in the main X-Men books, it was two primary storylines. You had the New Mutants struggling against the mutant baby-stealing demon Sim. That's S''YM, for the soul of magic. Yana Rasputin, who has become the Dark Child. And then you also have the X-Men and X-Factor struggling against the demon and, God help me, Nastir?
Sure.
N''ASTIRH. People, if you can help me out here, please. And also Mr. Sinister, and now the evil clone of Madeline Pryor, who is transformed into the Goblin Queen. That's not the Queen Goblin, unless you want us to get sued. And this is all in an attempt to regain the child of Scott and Madeline Summers. Scott Summers and Madeline, who would later become Cable. Love X-Men mythology. Yee! Meanwhile, the Goblin Queen opens a portal to Limbo, which allows demons to invade Manhattan and bring inanimate objects to life and fill them with murderous intent. And if any of this sounds familiar, that's because we revisited Inferno years later, but only a few years ago, with Dark Web and Chasm. Yeah.
Mark's favorite. Yeah.
I mean, I loved it. I loved it as much 2 years ago as I did rereading Inferno in retrospect. I'll say that much.
Yeah. And so I think for our purposes, the most important thing outside of the X-Men continuity is basically that Manhattan is invaded with demons, and elements of Manhattan start to come to life, meaning like the subway trains have faces on them and are trying to eat people, things like that, and that kind of silliness, rather than all of the sort of Inferno-y Madeline Pryor is now evil and has a really sexy outfit thing. That was probably the reason that the story is remembered, in the first place. But an interesting story, nevertheless. So we're also going to be talking about Acts of Vengeance, which, in terms of like scale of like remembered story, I think Inferno holds like a really kind of special place in most X-Men fans' hearts, whether they like it or not. It was a really kind of bombastic story that went on to kind of redefine a lot of the X-Men lore and be the kind of the kickoff point for a lot of the sort of like Jean and Madeline and Scott and Cable and all of that crazy stuff. And if you watch the X-Men like animated series reboot, they covered a lot of that story just a year ago or a year and a half ago when that series kicked off. But Acts of Vengeance, I don't think has a real kind of like following. It's not a book or an event that I really see talked about all that much. And I think it might be just because it has a fairly like not a very high concept idea behind it. the core idea of the series, and Roger Stern, if this sounds familiar, maybe like sue Marvel for something that happened 40 years ago.
Right.
The core idea of the series and the marketing was that Marvel's various superheroes would be facing off against supervillains that they had never met or were not part of their regular rogues gallery, which I joke because that was kind of the conceit of a large part of Roger Stern's Amazing Spider-Man run.
For sure.
To, I think, great success there.
Right.
And
Although I think, in that case, it wasn't so much like the villains intentionally planned to attack Spider-Man because he wouldn't be familiar with them. It was just like Roger Stern being like, I want Spider-Man to go against people he hasn't seen before, like the Juggernaut or Cobra or Mr. Hyde.
yeah. So to that point, yes, this was a concerted effort on behalf of the supervillains, right? So Loki, in disguise, coerces a group of the strongest supervillains to team up to destroy the Avengers. It's like Doom and like the not the Mad Thinker. What is it? Bentley. What's that guy's name? I can't even remember.
But Gravitron, Magneto.
Yeah. Just a lot of really big, like heavy hitters. And basically, also those heavy hitters engineer a jailbreak at the vault, which, Bendis would do with to kick off his new Avengers run,
right?
As well. But this basically releases the lesser villains of the Marvel universe to kind of go after the heroes and distract everybody so that this main group of villains can study it and then plan a more concentrated attack. And that's really how Spider-Man gets caught up in this. Is he does end up fighting some major villains, but it's mostly him kind of being the street level hero and battling against these like lesser foes that have all broken out of the vault. And as is typical for this kind of story, the villains ultimately end up failing because they can't stop bickering with each other. Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1 would love to get some dividends for copying its kind of its whole rationale. The Avengers force Loki to flee to Asgard, and that's where he makes one last desperate act and creates the robot Tri-Sentinel, which we'll talk about later in the episode. So let's talk about the Spider-Man sides of these things and what made them so distinct. So Inferno, right? You've got this big X-Men story, and Spider-Man is kind of brought into it. Maybe feels like a weird inclusion. And honestly, like Inferno was here and there across the Marvel line, but like took outside of the realm of the X-Men, Spider-Man got the most focus on it. And the same is true for Acts of Vengeance. Like it was across the Marvel line, but Spider-Man really, maybe because he had multiple titles, like took a break to really like be tied into this storyline. So Mark, what did they do with Spider-Man during this? And then I guess we could talk about whether we think it was effective or not.
Oh, for sure. Well, like in Amazing Spider-Man 311, it's one of the famous Todd McFarlane Mysterio covers. So we kind of have like a blur the line, like, are these Mysterio illusions or is this something else going on in the city? And then that brings us into Spectacular 146, where we kind of introduce the Harry Osborn subplot that's going to carry on throughout a lot of the Inferno Spider-Man stories. Web of Spider-Man 47. It's Spidey versus the Hobgoblin at Oscorp because the Jason Massendale Hobgoblin, fresh off of the Ned Leeds reveal and murder, and Jason Massendale becoming the Hobgoblin. He's trying to get more power via Oscorp, so he starts tormenting Harry Osborn to do that. Which brings us into Amazing Spider-Man 312, which was the Goblin War. It's Green Goblin versus Hobgoblin, except it's it's the Temu version of of both characters going up against each other. It's Harry, even though he's supposedly cured of his insanity as the Goblin, he's donning the Goblin garb again. In Spectacular 147. This is the famous Massendale makes a deal with the demon Nastor. I'm never gonna get that right. To trade his soul for power. That creates the Demogoblin for all you Maximum Carnage fans. Web of 48 is more of the story of the Demogoblin and Spider-Man trying to save Mary Jane. Then we kind of shift in Amazing Spider-Man 313, and now we got the lizards here. Surprise. And then Spectacular 148 is Night of the Living Ned. It's kind of, as I like to describe it, I guess you can't call it a floating Heads of Guilt. I guess it's a zombie corpse of guilt story for Spider-Man. It's Ned Leeds and Gwen Stacy's corpses rising from the dead, because of this Inferno thing going on in the city and tormenting poor Spider-Man. So there you go.
Well, you ended on Night of the Living Ned. That's actually my favorite of all of these stories, because for me, the way I think about it is it's like their personal demons come back to kind of like haunt them, and we can talk about that later. But it's a wide array of different types of stories that are going on here. Introduction of like what would eventually become, I wouldn't call Demogoblin a major foe, but he's become iconic if only because of his inclusion in Maximum Carnage, and Mark Bagley's drawings of him, which are always really awesome. As he kind of redesigned the character. I don't think they intended for this character to really go on for as long as he did in the pages of the comic, and he kind of lost his juice after these issues, if you even want to call it juice. But that is at least, I don't know if I would call it a collector's item, but it adds some level of importance that a Spider-Man foe that would be adapted to video games and other places does make his first appearance here.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think otherwise, if you look at these comics, though, it's, because, as we said earlier, this is the first major crossover storyline that wasn't we kind of had it with Secret Wars 2, where it was you had the mini, and then some of the heroes had their own Secret Wars 2 stories, and Spider-Man had the Book of Gold one, I think was the Notebook of Gold. This was certainly for the first time, this is an X-Men story, but we're gonna bring other heroes into it. And I think because of that, I think more so Michelini really struggles to create an actual narrative for this comic, for these tie-ins, other than okay, well, crazy stuff is happening, so I'm just gonna tie that into other Spider-Man villains and characters that seem aligned with that. The Mysterio issue specifically has some cool imagery, the lions coming alive at the public library. But is this really a Mysterio story? Inferno's not, it's one issue and then it's dropped, and then same with the Lizard. It's I kind of feel like Michelini's thought process was well, the Lizard's like a demon, so we'll bring the Lizard into it. And in reality, when you actually kind of pick through all the disparate plot lines, I think if this was to be done today off of an event, you would get a 5-issue miniseries that was about Jason Massendale trying to find more power and going after Harry Osborn, and that confrontation, and then Massendale eventually becoming the Demogoblin. I mean, does that sound about right to you, do you think?
Well, you say that,
yeah.
And I would normally agree with you, except for the fact that we got Dark Web, and it fully took over Amazing Spider-Man for a number of issues. And we got the weird Rec Rap and Chasm. And, I think that was a mess for a whole host of other reasons.
Yeah. But I think, I guess, well, even if it's not a mini series, Dan, I think, those stories, Dark Web, as much as we did not really enjoy it, there was dare I say, a cohesiveness to it. It didn't feel quite as disparate. I don't know. Like, it was just like, we're going to tell a through line involving Chasm and Hallows Eve in this story, and Madeline Pryor and all these other things. And you know, I don't want to call it focused because it wasn't, but it was, I feel it was more focused than specifically the non-Jerry Conway issues of the Inferno tie-ins are. And maybe that's just because it was just one creative team doing it. It was Zeb Wells and Ed McGuinness. Maybe having multiple creators and multiple creative teams. Like, I just feel like, and you know, Jerry bemoaned it when he was on our show earlier this season talking about his Spectacular and Web of runs, but like, I feel like he was more up to the challenge based on the output than Michelinie. And maybe that's just a reflection on what these books were like at that era too. But like I don't know. Like, I look at these ASM tie-ins and it's very clear to me. Michelinie's like, what do you want me to do? Whatever. I'm just going to have Todd draw some cool stuff and, you know, leave it at that. There's really no substance to the ASM tie-ins. And at least Conway is attempting to make something substantive here, even if at the end of the day, Jason Massendale becoming Bema Goblin is not really moving the needle in any kind of major way outside of Maximum Carnage.
I'm gonna yes and you there,
sure.
Which is to say, like, I think the Michelinie stuff is unfocused, but I also think that Spider-Man's role in this event, Inferno, was not very well like established or defined. He really does feel like it's like we'll include Spider-Man because he's a hero that exists in Manhattan and he's our flagship character. Whereas, like, you know, Dark Web, if we're really going to lean into that comparison, like, they elevate Spider-Man's role in the narrative there to make, like, King Chasm, and like ultimately the bigger bad between Madeline Pryor, you know, and him. And so, like, the story kind of flips, you know, and it's even reflective, I think, in the name, right? Dark Web is a Spider-Man story. Inferno is an X-Men story, you know, like, and so I think that's an interesting distinction between the two. And frankly, I don't love the Michelinie issues. I think they're fine and don't really understand sort of the assignment, which I feel like is kind of typical for a lot of the Spider-Man tie-ins to, like, major line-wide events.
Right.
But you're right. The Jerry Conway stuff, like, really gets it, and I think actually uses the Inferno for a really interesting sort of clarification of what his lane of comics in the Spider Office are doing, because Manhattan has come to life in this way. Not only is it fun to watch Spider-Man just fight Manhattan, right? Like, you know, it's often said that Manhattan and New York is like a character in the Spider-Man comics, and here it becomes sort of an active antagonist, which I think is kind of funny, and I think really is highlighted by the moment that Spider-Man fights his own Macy's Day Parade balloon, which, like, is a little bit fourth wall breaking, like,
sure,
for a, you know, like, a population that doesn't particularly love him to feature a balloon of him in this fictional Macy's Day Parade. But, like, if you're gonna go for, like, this one moment and ever do it in the comics, this was the one to do it in,
right?
And I think, like, it's a moment of brilliance from Michelinie. But, like, what Conway does is really focuses on what does the supporting cast do during Inferno? Like, what does the average citizen do when all of the materials around them start coming to life? And I think has a lot of fun with that, and has Spider-Man zipping around the city, bouncing around trying to save everybody, whether it's Mary Jane and her modeling crew wading through the sewers in order to avoid the chaos of the city streets and encountering the Demo Goblin down there. Mary Jane's Egyptian attire for a modeling suit, like, you know, should come to life. Like, all of that stuff I think is really great. And to me, it's, like, most highlighted in that Flash and Betty issue, Night of the Living Ned, which I think is really excellent because it makes those. It's not a zombie story, even though the cover would tell you that it was. That's like a nightmare that they're having. But the rest of the story is them fending off demons from their apartment that choose to take the form of Spider-Man and Ned Leeds. Flash, a Spider-Man that's sort of taunting him about his sort of position in the world versus this hero that he loves, and Ned, the dead, husband of Betty, like coming back to attack them. And it's really quite sinister and scary. And the two of them, who are fresh in a sort of new relationship with each other, fending off these demons that are their personal demons and realizing they don't need a superhero to come save them, I think is a really cool story. And it's like the one story that like really takes advantage of this to do something very character oriented. And I feel like you can see like Jerry Conway's heart in that particular story. And that's why it stands out to me. So if there's one thing to read, it's Spectacular 148 from me. I think that's a standout story from Jerry's involvement in this particular arc.
Yeah, no argument from me. Although what I will say is that I think that, if the Inferno tie-ins were all stories like that, I just don't. Not that I don't like. I can't even say if it was successful as is, but I think like if people think about the Spider-Man stories with Inferno in any kind of way, they come back to like the big shock, or not shock, but the big event of this event within an event was everything involving the Hobgoblin, because for all intents and purposes, this was the return of the Hobgoblin after the very botched reveal at the end of the DeFalco Friends run, and the Peter David issue and Priest and all that. In fact, if you go back to our very first interview with Jim Salicrup more than 10 years ago, I mean, he was like, hey, we put, they put Hobgoblin on ice, but like when Inferno came about, they were like, okay, here's our opportunity to finally start telling this story again. And, at this point, like, the character had become so diluted because it was like, well, it's Ned Leeds, or it's the Foreigner, or it's Richard Fisk, or it's Roderick Kingsley, or whatever. No, it's Massendale now, and we're gonna make him a demon just to kind of put him on his own direction. It didn't really work, obviously, although he was in the I'm not misremembering. He was in the the Return of the Sinister Six story, right?
That's correct. Yeah, over in Spider-Man proper. Yeah.
So I mean, like they did like go on to like use the character, in a pretty significant role for a bit, and then of course Maximum Carnage. But like it's very clear like that was like to me like the shiny object of the Spider-Man books was like the Hobgoblin's back. And then that leads us to, I alluded to it earlier, this Green Goblin versus Hobgoblin storyline in Amazing Spider-Man 312, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Which, kind of cracks me up because I think like I remember talking to Glenn Greenberg once, who he wrote the Goblins at the Gate story, which was the Norman Osborn versus Roderick Kingsley Hobgoblin in Spectacular Spider-Man, and he was like, yeah, I wanted to do that story because those two characters had never gone up against each other. Well, they did in that one issue of Amazing Spider-Man, but that doesn't count because like it's such a, like, to me, a very low stakes kind of deflated confrontation between what you would think would be more high powered. And I don't know if it's because it's Harry and Massendale or just because of the way Michelini wrote it. Do you have, again, any opinions on the matter?
To me, the thing that's most interesting about it is not the confrontation of the two. It's that like it's the outcome of it with like Harry using the Goblin as like a character or adventurer for good. Right, he dons the equipment in order to put down the Hobgoblin.
Right,
and then Spider-Man like challenges and says, "Hey, you could be a superhero," and he's like, "I'm busy. I have a family and all these other things to do," which is kind of a slap in the face, I think, to Peter Parker in some ways. And to me, that was always interesting because to me, this sets kind of the precedent. I mean, he did dress up as the Goblin earlier in Amazing Spider-Man to fend off the sort of phony Green Goblin. But that always felt kind of like self-contained to his own like legacy in some ways, although I guess the Hobgoblin is too. But I think we've seen this beat for Harry in particular come back over and over and over again, even all the way through Slot's concluding stories of Harry hopping on a glider to use it for good in some way, only for that to be subverted by Nick Spencer by saying that that was a clone or whatever. But to me, that's interesting that we keep coming back to this idea of like the superhero Green Goblin Harry that, yeah, I think is now sort of the main character of Ultimate Spider-Man that I affectionately call Ultimate Green Goblin.
Yeah.
So that's what's interesting to me, because the rest of it, you're right, is a deflated, I don't really need to see him fight Jason Massendale, because what does that mean to anyone? He just stole another dude's costume, made a deal with a demon, and I guess he's a powerful foe, but there's not really that kind of like personal tie there of like, I directly ripped off your father. It's like, it's kind of like a sort of like a adjacent story. Yeah.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel like it ties it all together. And, you know, again, like this is, you know, this was one of those comics where, you know, even if I was like, even though I'm trying to think if I picked this up in real time, I might have, but like, this was one of those comics I think like, you know, 15, 20 years ago, I went back to be like, oh man, that's, you know, after I had like a real, more of an appreciation of like where we were in history, it's like, I want to go back and reread this. And it was like, you know, like you got that really great McFarlane cover, which I know is like a statement you could probably make about 30 different comics from this run. But like you have this really great McFarlane cover, and then like you open it up and it's like, oh, it's like, oh, that's all. Whereas like, you know, again, like you could say the same with Night of the Living Dead and that like Conway's at least trying with this story. I think, you know, like, you know, Massendale really doesn't have much of a character, period. I would say, but like, you know, at least Conway is giving it the old college try of like trying to show like a descent into madness, like, oh, you know, like going to Oscorp to try and find, I guess, you know, try and find the formula of a serum, you know, that's not going to do it. So he's got to, you know, it makes Massendale even more desperate. So he goes and makes a deal with the devil. I mean, you know, Faustian tale, it's very, you know, tale as old as time, but you know, it works. You know, play the hits.
Well, I'm so glad you say that, because like I think at least my final note on Inferno and Spider-Man's tie-in is like, I think what you've just summarized is the summary of kind of most of this era of Spider-Man. Is like you've got you know, yes, the creation of Venom, which kind of like blew up everything and was a major cultural hit, but outside of that, it's kind of like Michelinie, I think, kind of struggling to figure out what to do with the title. Yeah. And meanwhile, Jerry Conway is like playing the like a virtuosic,
yeah,
you know, like yeah, whatever. I'm using music and I'm not a musician, but either way, like Jerry Conway's handling two simultaneous books that are effortlessly weaving in and out of each other and telling like truly classic Spider-Man stories, even if they've kind of been forgotten by time, by being overshadowed by Amazing Spider-Man. But like, you know, everything in Inferno is the same. Like Jerry Conway is like doing what he can with it and making it really sing. And Michelinie is like kind of struggling to figure out what the exact use of all of this is.
Yeah, for sure. All right, you want to start talking Acts of Vengeance, Dan? Because I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this, since I've kind of been on this show in the past defending this story.
Sure. Look, I'll get out of the gate. Like, this is not a favorite story of mine in the Spider-Man mythology. But I do think that there's some interesting things that are going on here. And I like its sort of kind of like overall structure as a story, where I think like all of the different titles do actually tie into each other in a more meaningful way than Inferno. It's like Michelinie was kind of included in the meetings here with like the other teams and Jerry Conway to kind of make something interesting. it's less, like I said, it's less high concept, which maybe means it's easier to weave through the different things. And it's not quite so far outside of Spider-Man's wheelhouse, although it kind of is. Like strangely enough, I think Spider-Man in this event, even if it's not focused on him, it's an Avengers and Fantastic Four event, probably goes through the most dramatic change of any character that's included in this event. So it starts off pretty simply in Amazing Spider-Man 326 with Graviton, who is a Avengers villain, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Who he's tasked by the sort of like cabal of Loki's supervillains to attack Spider-Man, and he like very dramatically goes to the Daily Bugle and lifts it directly up into the air to get Spider-Man's attention. And he ends up like Spider-Man comes and he defeats him pretty handedly, thinks he kills him. But obviously Spider-Man survives. We then move to a villain of a completely different power set of much lower stature in Spectacular 158, where Paste Pot Pete, who is one of these characters that escaped from the vault, attacks Spider-Man and also defeats Spider-Man, sinking him to the bottom of the Hudson with his paste. And Spider-Man, Peter escapes and he goes back to ESU to work with Dr. Max Lubitsch, who has this invention that Peter's helping him out with, and it overloads. And, you know, in classic Peter style, and I would say even like sort of call back to Alpha in the big time era, jumps in front of the beam, tries to save Lubitsch, but ends up being bombarded with extra dimensional energy, which is the thing that kind of kicks off this entire storyline, where Spider-Man is given all of these cosmic powers. He can blast energy out of his fingers, and Green Lantern style can control his webs with his mind and do these like weird constructs out of his webs. Which brings us to Web of 59, where Dr. Doom sends Titania after Spider-Man to test out Spidey's cosmic powers against a powerful foe that he would probably normally lose to. And of course, Spider-Man and Titania have history from Secret Wars.
Right.
She attacks the Bugle, which is currently owned by Thomas Fireheart.
The Puma.
And so Spidey and Puma leap into action, and Spidey is like thrown out of the building, and he would normally die, but he doesn't. He basically blasts Titania and ends the battle in like a heartbeat. And this is what truly turns Dr. Doom on to keeping an eye on Spider-Man, which would be kind of like a backbone of all the subsequent issues. We get Amazing Spider-Man 327 with Magneto. It's a kind of talk about kind of a misleading cover.
Right.
Like you really want to read a Spidey versus Magneto fight, and you kind of get one, but not really. Magneto is trying to use Spider-Man because he thinks he's so powerful, and it came on him so late in his life that he clearly must be a mutant.
Right.
And so Magneto is trying to use Spider-Man to, he's trying to recruit him to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants or whatever, so that in the upcoming war against humanity, he can have Spider-Man on his side with these cosmic powers. But ultimately, he's not read, the Grant Morrison run, where it was discovered that mutants have multiple powers each.
Right.
He says, Spider-Man has multiple powers, so clearly he can't be a mutant. Leaves the scene. So bummer there. Spectacular 159 is sort of a low-key issue. It's probably the most forgettable one of these, where Doom and the Wizard, which was the name I couldn't think of earlier, send the Brothers Grimm to attack Spider-Man. They lift Madison Square Garden up into the air, and Spidey goes and helps save some civilians and saves the stadium from falling and easily defeats the Brothers Grimm. If you're recognizing a pattern here, that's because that's kind of the story here is Spider-Man rinse repeat defeating people that I guess he shouldn't otherwise be able to defeat. So the next issue, Web of 60, he defeats Goliath on the Triborough Bridge. And because
That
the
is
Spider-Man
the
story...
RFK bridge now, Dan.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And it wouldn't be a Spider-Man story without a bridge, and he nearly destroys it in this one, which turns New York against him, and Spider-Man like kind of gets sad about it. And Goliath grows too big, and his heart goes out, and he collapses. There's that. Amazing Spider-Man 328. Sebastian Shaw sends the Hulk after Spider-Man. The Hulk arrives. They fight to a draw. The Hulk tells him we'll meet up again on Roosevelt Island because we're covering all of Manhattan-ish in here. And Spidey punches the Hulk into outer space, then flies up, saves him, and the Hulk's like, oh, he must be good. I'm going to stop attacking him. Again, repeating the same thing. We get Spectacular 160. Spidey fights Hydra Man and Shocker, and the citizens of New York throw garbage at him for destroying the bridge. And then Doom sends a Tess 1 robot after Spidey, which Spidey again defeats. Then we get Web of 61, Dragon in the Dark, where the Wizard sends Dragon Man after Spidey, which again Spider-Man defeats. Except this time the citizens of Manhattan cheer him on, which makes him like restored his faith in the people of the city. And then we've got your favorite Mark, 329 of Amazing Spider-Man Power Prey, where Loki is kind of defeated in the main books. And so his final act of vengeance is to use Sebastian Shaw's Sentinel program to merge all the Sentinels together into the tri-sentinel, where Spidey finally assumes the form of Captain Universe with the uni-power and uses it to take down the tri-sentinel and loses his command of the uni-power and returns to normal. And this is where I actually start to like this story at the very end, which is Web of 64 and 65, where basically all of those losers that Spider-Man has defeated before gang up and do what the Sinister Six could not do, which is team up to take down Spidey, and Spidey has to basically beat them all again, except without the powers that he had before. And okay, he ends up winning and turning the foes back on Chameleon and Kingpin, who are the people that are masterminding their inclusion in this. It's kind of a cop-out, but I think it's at least structurally cool in that it's like, oh, now we'll have Spidey fight all these guys, and he's underpowered, and I think that's a cool story. And if you were curious about what would happen to Spidey if he didn't have lose his cosmic powers, go check out What If 31, which is actually Legacy number 79, where Spidey like keeps all of the powers and then ends up fighting Thor because Thor won't end a famine in Africa. It's a dumb comic, Mark. But it does feature MJ and Spider-Man having a child together. It ends up being a daughter. So you could say this is kind of maybe the first appearance of a Spider-Man daughter.
Yeah.
And the big mystery here is, was she conceived before or after Cosmic Spider-Man? And when she opens her eyes, they're all white, and it turns out she has the power cosmic inside her, and we were all chilled for all the rest of time.
So not only do
sorry for belaboring that, but it is a belabored story in the pages of Spider-Man. This thing goes on forever.
So
Mark.
This is the first appearance of not just radioactive sperm, but cosmic radioactive sperm. I'm sorry.
That's it. That's it.
I had
Mark.
to do it, all you Spider-Man Rain fans. Look, Dan, when you explain it like that, and boy, did you explain it like that, it makes me kind of embarrassed that I like this story. With that said, I still like the story, so you don't at me, bro. No.
Do you like it in like fits and bursts, or do you like it overall?
I like it overall. I look like in terms of like where I came around on this comic, on this arc. I had probably read this in pieces over the course of my fandom, but then like when I was working on Chasing Amazing umpteen years ago, someone had said, "Oh, you should talk about the Cosmic Spider-Man arc." So I just like sat down and read through all these issues, and I don't. They are clearly flawed. I'm not gonna like pretend like this is not some like base level dumbness, but like I I thought this was a lot of fun. I don't normally go for Spider-Man too far removed from the neighborhood, if you will. But like I felt like what I liked about this whole conceit was with him with the cosmic powers, was like if you're gonna do like a crazy Spider-Man, not grounded and tethered to reality story, then you have to go all in. And just like watching him, kick the crap out of Titania and the Brothers Grimm and Dragon
And
Man
the Hulk,
and
yeah.
the Hulk, and like they lean into it. They really do. And like, like McFarlane and you have McFarlane on his last issue, like being totally game. That Hulk issue, in my mind, is amongst the most iconic things that he's done on this book. Both, the cover and the interiors.
Sure.
And then, Larson is coming on, and Larson's having a good time too. I mean, like, I think that a lot of this is the most inspired stuff that Larson would do on this comic. I don't know if it was because he just grew tired of working with Michelinie, because we know that the two of them really didn't get along during the course of their run. So it was still early, but like, I just felt like Larson was more on his game in those issues as well. And, like, I think both Michelinie and Conway, Michelinie understood the assignment, I think, far more on this one than he did on Inferno. And maybe he just wrapped his brain around it better. But like, even with its flaws, I was just like, the famous, tri-sentinel issue, which, I know we talk about a lot, or I talk about a lot. Like, it's at its core, it's a Spider-Man story. It's like, yes, he gets the powers of Captain Universe, which are insane for Spider-Man. Like I'm not disputing that, but like, at its core, it's a story about power and responsibility and sacrifice, and like, what do I do with all this power? And like, there's this great scene, even, a couple of issues earlier. I think it's either in Spectacular or Web Up, but it's one of I think it's a Web Up issue, because it's Saviak is the artist on it, where it's like Peter Parker like lying on the floor in front of a TV eating a TV dinner. So this is Jerry Conway, and he's just like, I have all this power, and what am I doing? I'm sitting in front of the TV. Like, you know what I mean? Like they go out of their way to like show both the absurdity and to tether it back to who Peter is at his core. And like I as a result, I just have a lot of fun with these comics. Like, I'm just like, it's all just one big it's I laugh that there's a what if story about this, because this is all just a what if story, but they're having fun with it, and they're it's a what if story if it's a what if story in the way that like Parker Industries was a what if story. Like, we're going to tell this over the duration of the continuity of the main book, so we can't go too insane with it. Like, that's the thing about what if. It's like, most of those are done in one story, so it's like, we can have insane things happen because it's all going to reset in another month. Whereas like this, they have to be somewhat pragmatic yet insane with it, and it works for me, like, in that regard, like, flaws and all. So,
well, I think you make a really solid point about the thematic core of it. The sort of like, I have all of this power. What is my responsibility to it?
Yeah.
I wish it had more kind of to say about it. I love the image that you pointed out in regard to like the TV dinner, and like, can I go on being Peter Parker if I know I have the power to rewrite the universe, ostensibly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. And I wouldn't be opposed to revisiting that idea in some way. And I think people have kind of skirted on that over the years. Like, what happens if we level up Peter, the sort of like you mentioned Parker Industries worldwide, like the sort of, now I'm creating the Uncle Ben Foundation. And like, if I have all this money, then like, how do I upgrade myself in order. My responsibility needs to match my power. Whereas here he kind of like balks at that challenge.
Yeah.
Like I think immediately he's like, I just don't even want to do anything because I don't think that I can match the responsibility for this power. It makes me wonder if there's a version of this where it's like Peter doing scientific, equations to figure out like if I have all this power and I get to play God, what's the most effective way for me to save the most people? And it challenges him in that way. Although that sounds like it's getting dangerously close to like a kill code story, which Lord knows, how exhausted I am of those stories.
Right.
Currently playing out in Spider-Verse versus Venomverse. But yeah, I do think you're right. It is meaningfully a Spider-Man story, and I do think that's important. And I do think, again, tying in the sort of like low-level villains in it and that structure, I think it is really solid as well. I like this okay. It's not anywhere near the top of my list or one I think about all the time. I will say, as much as I like the sort of powered up Spider-Man thing, I do think it's a bit of a missed opportunity for us to get like the sort of like Spider-Man versus other people's foes, but on a much more powerful level.
Yeah.
Right? Like I would love to see a Spider-Man versus Magneto story where like it's just Spider-Man with Spider-Man's powers.
Right. Well,
like,
that's I was gonna say that is the kind of the under the radar thing about this whole storyline, which is like it's clear that they like looked at the thesis for Acts of Vengeance and they determined early on like, well, we can't have Spider-Man do this unless we power him up in some way.
Yeah.
Like that's the glory about the Roger Stern run and why to me like Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut will be is a top 5 Spider-Man story of all time in my opinion. It's because Spider-Man is stopping the Juggernaut using just his regular bag of tricks, what I mean? And here it's clearly different and you're right. I mean, it's a better story if he doesn't have to have it. But like I think that's part of it. This is not a top 5 story. To me it's a top 50 story, which might be debatable for some people.
Sure,
but like if I like of all the countless dozens and dozens and hundreds of stories, like I would put this in the top 50, because I feel like okay, we're gonna play with a wild conceit and then just like go all the way with it. But like the better, more elegant story is like how does Spider-Man get his way out of this without cosmic powers, like the Hulk is going after him. What does he do? You know what I mean? Like
I don't even know if that's necessarily the better story because I feel like we've gotten that, right? Like I feel like the Gauntlet is like, what if all Spider-Man's villains, but powered up to, 11, that's not necessarily true of all of them. Like the Rhino story is a sort of moral challenge up to 11, or the Sandman one too. I guess he powers himself up by splitting his mind. But the ultimate challenge there is, do I return Chemia to, a fundamentally broken system, there might be something interesting too. Like what if you got like for these, whatever, 12 issues it is, like a series of Nothing Can Stop the Juggernauts. And what does that do to Peter long term? To have to face that gauntlet, so to speak, of super powerful villains that he can barely get through. I don't know that we've necessarily seen that in a Spider-Man title. It comes here and there, and maybe it would get boring. But like I always think about what would the I don't always think about it. I need better things to do with my time. But when I read this, I think like what does this play out like if he doesn't have the cosmic powers? I mean, really, the answer is he'd be dead or whatever, or he'd find a way. I don't know how Spider-Man defeats Magneto personally, but someone's going to say to me, he fought him in this issue and won. And I'm sure I've read that issue and I'm not remembering it right now. But I will say the reason I say I don't think that's necessarily better is I'm glad that they took a weird choice, right? Like it's not often you get the ability to just make a choice as weird as giving Spider-Man cosmic powers. And the result is this sort of iconic costume and idea that we've seen come back here and there and has been memorialized in other places. And frankly, we could use a little bit of people we're about to get one in the Joe Kelly run. It seems like a very weird swing. But like, you don't get like really cool stuff like Superior Spider-Man or Cosmic Spider-Man unless you're willing to go to that weird place. And so maybe my version without the powers is the safe and uninteresting one that we're not talking about right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go, Dan. Do you want to talk about kind of what these two stories, Inferno and Acts of Vengeance, kind of mean for Spider-Man tie-ins on a larger scale?
Yeah, sure. Because I do think that, like, I don't know necessarily that people were copying either of these formulas. Like, I think both of these were kind of still trying to figure out how do we do this.
What is the formula? Yeah.
Yeah, but there would not really be a major line-wide event going forward that didn't see fit to include Spider-Man in it. As events became kind of the name of the game at Marvel, this kind of stuff would happen over and over again. Now, not always taking over every Spider-Man title in this fashion, although I have a list of some examples. This did, in some ways, establish at least the beginnings of a formula. What do you think? Like, what do you see kind of echoed from this, or what did they learn from this?
Yeah, I mean, at its at its most cynical, I think both kind of set the standard in terms of like, how do we disrupt the flow of the books and put creators in uncomfortable spots? Because again, like when we were talking to Jerry about his run, like, he still brings it up like, oh, and then those Inferno and Acts of Vengeance stories. You know what I mean? Like he's clearly unhappy with them, even if we were like, actually, you did a good job, Jerry. But you know what I mean? Like this is like, creators don't like this, and yet like Marvel needs to do it for whatever reason. It's clearly the fact that Inferno is the first one, I think that struggles the most in terms of like, how do we make this work?
Yeah.
I think they get it more for Acts of Vengeance, at least as it ties into Spider-Man, even though it's a much flimsier premise. Because that's the thing, like Inferno, there is a story to Inferno. I think it's nonsense, but there is a story to it. There really is no story to Acts of Vengeance. It's just like, yeah, those guys are going to go against these guys now. You know what I mean? Like, and go. But like at the same time, like they're clearly, the creative teams are more in sync. Like I feel like the three books for Spider-Man tie into each other better in Acts of Vengeance. Like it truly does read like the weekly saga that the book would become later in the Clone Saga. I mean, you could say how well did those actually read, but whatever. And so, I mean, like they're clearly formative and important in that right, in terms of like it worked out some of the kinks and has a legacy in its own right. But like, again, and you corrected me, when I mentioned this earlier, but like, I feel like probably the most successful cases of these have been like when, say like Civil War II, the Amazing Spider-Man tie-in, like Civil War II, the book was terrible, but the Spider-Man tie-in was pretty good. Like we enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
And because it was a 5-issue or whatever miniseries that was kind of separate and had its own creative team, and they just told the story. And like I like the House of M Spider-Man mini, and we've had others that like have tied into like larger storylines, and I think those are the most successful cases. Whereas like trying to kind of shoehorn it into the main narrative, even when it's like Even like something like Absolute Carnage, which you think would just be like a slam dunk. Like I didn't love those issues of Amazing Spider-Man during the Nick Spencer.
I thought we liked we said this is the best version of like this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but like I think because like not for nothing, Dan. It was also like, oh look, they're trying to tie this into Kindred, and like
Yeah.
we saw how that paid off ultimately. So I think if we went back and reread those, we'd be like, oh yeah, no, it didn't work either. You know what I mean? Like so.
Yeah. At the time, though, it felt like a revelation. It was like we're finally getting somewhere with this.
Yeah.
Like, we're finally like starting to like, bring all the threads together for the Kindred. Yeah.
Yeah, sound the alarm. But yeah. Anyway, that's I feel like I'm rambling, but ultimately, like I'm like, yeah, it's a legacy. It's important. I think it sets the standard. But there was still work to be done, and frankly, even with work to be done, it's just a very imperfect science that I don't think Marvel has still figured out years later.
No, not at all. Although I do think at least they're kind of like playing it with a sort of like case by case basis now. Like I think there are like your like S tier events like your Civil War or where like it makes sense to disrupt the line because it is disruptive to the entire universe, and so like to not include it in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man, especially given what happens in that story. Would make Spider-Man feel like he is wholly separate from the rest of the universe,
Yeah.
And so like I think they kind of tend to look at it and say like, what is the scale here, and then like how big of a deal should this be within the world of this character, and whether they're successful or not, I think it's a case by case basis. So like I made a list here of the events that I think actually disrupt Amazing Spider-Man, and disrupt is not always like meant as a bad term,
but they're an intrusion on the book.
Right. They like alter the flow of the story. So Civil War is the big one, right? We get the new Iron Spider suit. We get him revealing his identity, and it would ultimately alter the entire course of that book's like finale through the JMS run. And frankly, I thought Civil War was a shot in the arm to that book that desperately needed it in like the sort of like Deodato era of where I felt like post Romita the book had been kind of like flagging.
Yeah.
And like this was a really intriguing storyline. You get that great fight between Cap and Spidey that becomes like the really super quotable like like stand like a tree stuff, and a lot of that is down to JMS just doing something interesting and Spider-Man having a legit role to play in that story. And then you've got like Dark Reign, which like if people don't or forget what that storyline was, that was when I'm forgetting the name of the American Son.
Yep.
The that storyline during Brand New Day, and like Dark Reign was not an event in the same way as these others. It was a sort of like year-long line-wide like status quo.
Where the bad guys were in charge basically,
but you did get that Dark Reign logo on the front of the book. You've got Original Sin, which like had the introduced Silk.
Cindy Moon.
And
Pheromones.
that truly felt like it was inserted out of nowhere. Like the issue opens with Spider-Man like seeing a vision from an eyeball, and if you hadn't read that, it's quite weird. Secret Wars obviously canceled the line and rebooted it as Renew Your Vows, which like again I would elevate that to like it would be weird for Spider-Man to not acknowledge that the entire universe came to an end.
Right.
Did he need his own pocket universe where he and Mary Jane had a daughter and all that stuff? Maybe not. But like, what else are you going to do in that period? That was a bold experiment and truly a place where they gave a lot of people a jumping off point.
Right.
Secret Empire tied into Worldwide in its conclusion, where like Otto was like in a new suit, working for, and it was very lightly touching on Secret Empire, but like nevertheless there it was on the cover. You mentioned Absolute Carnage already. We had that really strange Inferno and Hellfire Gala tie-in to the Zeb Wells run, where I think you and I were like, this is the first time this book has like truly gone off the rails.
Yeah.
It was like, what even is this issue with like Mary Jane as like a robot or something like that.
Yeah.
And then right after that, you got the Judgment Day issue, which like I thought was a strong issue, but like also felt like truly out of nowhere.
Right.
And I don't think needed to be in Amazing Spider-Man proper, right? Like, like I guess some of the impact of Gwen's return there affected the rest of the run, but like that could have been a one shot or a mini series.
Right.
And then we talked about Dark Web, and I think that's the point where we truly were like, we're worried about the Zeb Wells run. By the time we got to Dark Web,
blink twice if you need help.
Yeah. So like, I guess this is all to say, like, some of these are really effective and some of them are not. And to me, I think the ones that really work are the ones that like really truly feel like they have to happen, like because the whole universe has changed.
Yeah.
And you can feel it, I think, nowadays the most. I think for whatever reason, Joe and like late era Zeb Wells kind of got to ignore a lot of what was going on in the Marvel universe, even more so than I think than Dan Slott did. And I wonder if that's just like an acknowledgement that like disrupting Amazing Spider-Man is maybe not the way to go.
Yeah.
But now I feel like you can feel it all over the B titles. Like Miles Morales can't go a storyline without being disrupted by some other crossover. And maybe it's to boost the numbers on the book and get people to pick it up or something because it's a B title that needs to be published because it's an important character. But like it has really disrupted the flow of that book, which feels like it has no identity of its own except to be connected to the larger events that are going on. And so I think ASM is actually on a smoother path at the moment. Mm-hmm. Whereas some of the B titles are, I think, really struggling with this, like how this stuff is handled.
Right. Give it time.
But yeah, I think ultimately the weight is, if we don't mention or don't include the main story, does it make Spider-Man feel like he's not a part of the main universe? Versus if we do, shoehorn this in, does it disrupt the flow of this individual title? And I think those are the two wolves that are always wrestling within Amazing Spider-Man and the various titles, like, to say like, how important is this thing? And how important is this thing will always also be co-opted by how many books do we need to sell to justify doing this event and to pad our wallets and maybe get people to pick up books they weren't otherwise reading because they have a collector's mentality when it comes to reading an event. Yeah. But I also wonder, I think events have they obviously still sell books, but it's not like Civil War. I think the public has largely stopped caring in the way that they used to about the major Marvel events. And so,
well, that's it too. I mean, and granted, we've liked some of the events, like certainly like, Hickman's Secret Wars and oh God, I'm saying we liked it, and yet I can't remember the name of it. But the most recent one with the vampires.
Blood Hunt.
Blood Hunt was solid, I thought. But like, I think the other factor that you just kind of alluded to here was like, I think the tie-ins are frankly as good as the event itself. And like, like we still talk about the Amazing Spider-Man Civil War issues because like Civil Wars was an impactful story. I mean, I have flaws, I think there are flaws with it for sure. But like that story just like, it hit it out of the park in terms of like being in the mainstream eye and getting like, mainstream attention and then like weaving in its characters in a way that mattered. Even if people are like, oh, you completely massacred Tony Stark or what, in terms of how he was written. But like it felt like everyone, we said earlier in the episode, like did certain people get the assignment? It feels like everyone in Marvel got the assignment when it came to the Civil War books. And I think it's one of the few times where like no one thought of it as a burden. And the fact is, and I think the the disruptions of Secret Wars work. And like, did we need a pocket universe for Peter and Mary Jane? No, but like, that's one of the more famous stories that we've had in the last 10, 15 years. You know what I mean? Like people still talk about that story, you know? Like, I mean, they talk about it. Oh, we only get them when it's in a non-continuity universe, but they talk about it. You know what I mean? Like, so anyway, that's just kind of like my other observation in all this. It's like, I think the better events lend itself to better tie-ins, you know?
I do think, like, getting back to Inferno and Acts of Vengeance, like the struggle there, I think, is, you know, and I think Acts of Vengeance did a better job of finding the lane that Spider-Man operates in the story.
Right.
Is that, like, I think Marvel has gotten better about saying this is a event book in the Spider office, right? And so you get your like Spider-Verse, and it doesn't feel the need to have a Captain America Spider-Verse issue.
Right.
I say that while also loving Spider Island and acknowledging that series was super bloated with a ton of, you know, stories that probably didn't need to exist. And yet I think the high concept was so fun that it somehow made its way past that.
Yeah.
But I think they've been a lot better about going, hey, we don't need to include X and X and X in it. Now, I say that, and I just mentioned the Hellfire Gala and Judgment Day issues. So what do I know? But it does feel like there's no Powers of X Spider-Man.
No.
You know?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's always going to be a mixed bag, and things are being learned and forgotten in equal manner. And Inferno and Acts of Vengeance maybe end up being a really like great look at like how these things have existed and continue to exist. And it is interesting to like that they did manage to like take over all of the books. I don't think we see that today, and I'm grateful for that in some ways, unless there's a story that really calls for it. And I don't think Secret War and Dark Reign, Civil War and Dark Reign, which I think are my two kind of favorite events of all of Marvel. I don't think we're in an era of sort of editorial leadership that can command that much control over the books anymore. And so like, I'm happy for them to kind of like maybe seed that and not try to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right, Dan, why don't we bring it on home?
Sure, Mark, take us home.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, but we want to thank you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk. On the next episode of Season 7, we will be joined by artist Eric Larson to talk about his artwork in Amazing Spider-Man number 329. That's right. It's the introduction of Cosmic Spider-Man and the Tri-Sentinel. You might have just heard about it in this episode. We hope you'll join us for that excellent discussion with our great guest, Eric Larson.
And as a reminder, this podcast exists because of the support of our listeners on Patreon, where for only $4.99 a month, the cost of a new comic, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including the reviews that we do and the special seasonal episodes, which helps us get someone like Eric Larson to come on. So be sure to tune in to the next episode. We also send out exclusive artwork and a ton of other bonuses. So thank you to everybody who supports us and our work. Plus an extra special thanks to Kevin Hines, our good friend, for becoming a new member of our Patreon. It almost feels bad having Kevin support us on the Patreon, given he supports us by being on the show. But nevertheless, thank you, Kevin. If you want to join Kevin's ranks, please go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and click on the Patreon button to sign up to join our club.
I can't wait till we thank Mark Chinacchio for becoming a new Patreon. If you value Smart's comics criticism and historical analysis, we hope you'll consider supporting us on Patreon. What we do on the show is admittedly niche. Still, if you find our Spider-Man commentary and community valuable, we can only continue doing what we do with your support on Patreon.
So, Mark, until our podcast microphones come to life and try to strangle the life out of us, What's our motto?
If only, Dan. With great podcasts, there must also come the amazing Spider Talk.